Bugatti Veyron starts perfectly, and then dies 1 second later. No warning that makes sense. No obvious blown fuse. The fuel pumps are running. The battery has power. The keys appear to be working. And yet, this multi-million-dollar hypercar simply refuses to stay alive. Then the diagnostic system reveals the message that changes everything. No communication with the fuel pump control module. At first, it sounds like a simple electrical problem. Find the fuse. Replace it. Start the car. But that's where things got much worse. Because this wasn't a normal car where you could walk into a parts store and grab a replacement module. This was a Bugatti Veyron, and the tiny electronic component causing all this trouble would eventually lead to a repair bill of around £400-500 and a trip to an official Bugatti service center. But before they reached that conclusion, they had to eliminate almost every other possibility. And some of the things they discovered along the way were completely unexpected. The first assumption was obvious. If the car says there is no communication with the fuel pump control module, maybe the module isn't receiving power. So the team went straight to the fuses. Simple, right? Except this Bugatti doesn't make simple easy. The Veyron has multiple fuse locations, complicated access points, and components hidden in places that would be frustrating even on an ordinary vehicle. They began checking everything they could find. Fuse after fuse. Connection after connection. Nothing. The fuses weren't the problem. And this is where the diagnosis became more interesting. Because the engine wasn't completely dead. It would actually start. For a brief moment, the Veyron would fire up. Then almost immediately, stall. That tiny detail was extremely important. If the engine couldn't start at all, the team could investigate ignition, fuel delivery, immobilizer systems, and a dozen other possibilities. But the fact that it started and then died suggested something was being allowed to happen temporarily before the car's electronic systems shut it down. So now the question changed. What was stopping the engine after it had already started? One possibility was the immobilizer. And honestly, the symptoms made that theory believable. A security system problem can make a perfectly healthy engine start and then shut down almost immediately. So the keys were investigated. The immobilizer system was checked. The diagnostic system was examined for related faults. But again, nothing obvious. The immobilizer wasn't giving them the answer they were looking for. Then another suspect appeared. An aftermarket tracking system. The Veyron had additional electronics installed, and whenever a car refuses to start properly, aftermarket equipment can become a major suspect. A tracker with a power problem. A bad connection. A communication issue. Anything interfering with the factory electronics could potentially create chaos. So that had to be investigated too. But once again, the evidence wasn't pointing there. And now the team was running out of the easy answers. The fuses were good. The immobilizer wasn't the obvious problem. The tracker wasn't giving them the explanation. The keys weren't suddenly useless. Yet the Veyron still wouldn't stay running. And this is where the diagnostic process became much more important than simply replacing parts. Because on a car like this, guessing can get incredibly expensive. Instead of throwing parts at the problem, the team started looking at what the car was actually telling them. The fuel pressure data revealed something interesting. There was an imbalance between the two engine banks. That immediately pushed the investigation deeper into the fuel system. The Veyron wasn't simply suffering from a mechanical fuel problem. Something was happening between the fuel pumps and the electronic systems controlling them. And that brought them back to the mysterious control module. But there was still one major problem. How could they prove that the module itself was actually faulty? This is where one of the smartest diagnostic tests came into play. Instead of assuming the module was bad, they began swapping components between the engine banks. The idea was simple. If the problem moved when the ECU was moved, then the ECU could be responsible. If the problem stayed in the same place, something else had to be causing it. It was essentially a process of elimination. And the results started narrowing the possibilities. The fuel pumps themselves weren't behaving like the original culprit. The ECU units weren't suddenly creating the same problem when swapped. The evidence kept pointing toward one central component. The fuel pump control module. And then they found something that made the whole situation even more interesting. The module appeared to have cracked solder joints. To anyone looking at a normal car, that might sound like a relatively small problem. But inside a Bugatti Veyron, a tiny electronic failure can become a massive mechanical headache. This little module was effectively sitting between the car's fuel system and the electronic control necessary to keep everything working properly. If communication was lost, the car couldn't correctly manage the system. And suddenly the strange symptoms made sense. The Veyron could start briefly using the fuel that was already available. But once the control system needed to take over properly, the failure became obvious. The engine couldn't continue running. So the team tried something that seemed worth attempting before spending thousands on a replacement. They attempted to repair the module. The cracked solder joints were reflowed. The hope was simple. A Bugatti Chiron per Sport had been declared a total loss. Not because the engine was destroyed. They can be dismantled. They can be investigated. And in some circumstances, independent expertise can challenge assumptions about what is supposedly impossible. The trash can wasn't really the important part. The trash can was the symbol. It represented the idea that the knowledge surrounding an extraordinary machine doesn't necessarily have to remain locked behind a factory wall. And that idea reaches far beyond Bugatti. Cars are becoming more electronic, more software dependent, more controlled. Manufacturers increasingly determine how vehicles are diagnosed, serviced and repaired. So the Chiron became a perfect example of a much larger debate. What does ownership actually mean? Does buying the machine mean you own it completely? Or do you own the physical object while the manufacturer still controls the knowledge required to keep it alive? And perhaps the most interesting part is what happened next with Bugatti itself. The company moved forward with the Tourbillon, a machine that places enormous emphasis on mechanical engineering, craftsmanship and visible technology. An 8.3-liter naturally aspirated V16. A hybrid system. Watch-inspired instrumentation. A machine designed to feel mechanical rather than simply digital. And that philosophy fits strangely well with what Matt's rebuild revealed. People don't just want to know how fast these machines are. They want to understand them. They want to see how they work. They want to hear the engine. They want to watch the rebuild. They want to know what happens underneath the carbon fiber. And that's exactly why Matt's story became so powerful. Because he didn't simply show people a Bugatti. He opened one up. He exposed the engineering. He challenged the assumptions. And he forced a conversation between the factory and the enthusiast community that might never have happened otherwise. So, did Matt Armstrong destroy Bugatti's repair system? No. But he did something perhaps more important. He showed that the factory doesn't have to be the only place where knowledge exists. And Bugatti's decision to lift the blacklist suggests that even the most exclusive manufacturers may eventually have to find a balance between safety, brand protection, and owner freedom. The Chiron wasn't just a wreck anymore. It became a test. A test of how much control a manufacturer should have over a car after it's been sold. And the answer is still evolving. If you enjoyed this kind of deep dive into the hidden stories behind the world's most incredible cars, subscribe to Turbo Drive and turn on notifications, because we're going much deeper into the machines, controversies and rebuilds that the automotive world doesn't always show you. Because the next time someone tells you a car is impossible to repair, you might want to ask one question first. Is it actually impossible, or have we simply been told that it is?